You are living in the year 612 BCE, believe it or not. Or try and imagine that that is the year you're living in. You could work out that would mean 5 years to go before 607. Of course, living back there, you wouldn't know the significance of that. That was the year that the Babylonians destroyed ancient Jerusalem. However, you're a very unusual person, inasmuch as you're one of the few in Jerusalem that has actually listened to what Jehovah's prophet Jeremiah has said and done something about it. You're one of the very tiny minority of loyal worshippers of Jehovah that's left. And though it goes very much against the grain, because Jehovah's temple is still in operation, he hasn't destroyed it yet, you feel out of loyalty you must go there because it still is supposedly the center of true worship. But it's not a pleasant experience at all. In fact, you feel far more distressed at going to Jehovah's temple than satisfied, because when you get there, you know that every conceivable form of false worship is being carried on. For example, just recently, though you could hardly believe it, you heard that 25 women, in fact a larger group than that, had held a festival right inside Jehovah's temple to the Babylonian god Tammuz. A festival right in the temple. And that is just not the only thing that's gone on there. Even worse things. In fact, today you go in via the northern gateway to the outer courtyard, and just on your way in you see an enormous wooden pole, and you know very well what that pole represents. In fact, it's what we would call nowadays an Asherah pole. It's a phallic symbol, right there in Jehovah's temple. Asherah was Baal's wife, and this is being carried on right in Jehovah's house. And yet, it is Jehovah's house, and you still feel you should be there until he indicates otherwise. You can only go as far as the entrance to the inner courtyard. Of course, inside that was the temple building itself, and only priests and Levites were allowed inside the inner courtyard. And you can not go inside, but you can see through the gateway what's going on. And what you see inside just tops the lot. It just seems inconceivable, because right there in the inner courtyard you see 24 or so men. They are on their knees, bowing down in worship, but not toward Jehovah's temple, but with a calculated insult in mind, with their very backs to Jehovah's temple. In fact, they are bowing down toward the sun worship. And in fact, at this stage, despite the fact that supposedly this is Jehovah's temple, you cannot take any more as one who loves Jehovah and his ways, and you've just got to leave. As you leave, you notice somebody that you recognize, a very prominent individual in ancient Jerusalem. You know his name, and you think, well, that's Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. He doesn't seem in the least bit bothered about all these things that have disgusted you in Jehovah's temple. In fact, he hurries right inside the inner courtyard into an inner dining room. And in fact, because it's inside, you cannot see exactly what's going to happen next. All you notice is a smell of incense coming out of that inner room. But it's just as well you don't know what is going on inside. And you notice some other individuals, around about 70 of them, pursuing Jaazaniah into that room, and they seem about the same business that he is. It's just as well you don't know, because it would disgust you even more. Now, the rest of us do know what was going on inside that room because Ezekiel was given a vision of it. Perhaps you remember it. It's in Ezekiel chapter 8. Would you like to turn to it now? All the other details that we've been speaking about are in the opening verses of this chapter. But this is what was going on supposedly in secret in the inner room. So have you got verse 10? So I went in and began to see, and look, there was every representation of creeping things and loathsome beasts and all the dungy idols of the house of Israel, the carving being upon the wall all round about. And 70 men of the elderly ones of the house of Israel, with Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, standing in among them, were standing before them, each one with his censer in his hand, and the perfume of the cloud of the incense was ascending. And he proceeded to say to me, have you seen, O son of man, what the elderly ones of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each one in the inner rooms of his showpiece? For they're saying, Jehovah's not seeing us, Jehovah's left the land. Now this is almost inconceivable, isn't it? How on earth can we imagine that ones who knew all about Jehovah God, who had the scriptures, all the background of those things, how on earth could they imagine that Jehovah could not see what they were doing in his temple? It seems very difficult to take in that people could get to that state of mind, doesn't it? But that was what had happened. They'd become entirely desensitized to the reality of Jehovah and his view of them. Now, very interesting as all that is, you might be wondering, what's it got to do with us? Because you don't hear about people being disfellowshipped for idolatry nowadays, do you? When was the last time that you heard of a brother having a sacred pole in his front room? Or has anybody in your congregation been found out for worshipping animals, perhaps? It sounds a little bit unrelated to our needs, doesn't it? But would you turn to 1 John? One might imagine that with the advent of the Christian era, that idolatry, well, that was all a thing of the past. Maybe it affected the Israelites, but it's surely not one of the problems for the Christian congregation. Well, so one might think. But have you got chapter 5 and verse 21? Little children, guard yourselves from idols. You know it. Now that's a peculiar thing, isn't it? Because how on earth could we imagine idolatry within the Christian congregation? It just doesn't seem to hang together with reality, does it? Well, clearly we have to think about this matter. Perhaps it doesn't have to do with literal idols. Perhaps a few words about what an idol is and was might sharpen our thoughts on it. I suppose when we think of an idol, we usually think of an image of some kind, perhaps a statue or a carving or a painting, something like that, that is an object of worship or passionate devotion. And of course Jehovah has always been very strongly against such things. Now why? What's wrong with it? Well, think of the 10 Commandments, the second of which is relevant to the matter of idolatry. If I quote it to you, you can probably go over it in your own minds. It says, you must not bow down to them, because I, Jehovah your God, am a God exacting exclusive devotion. So the reason idolatry in that form was wrong was because it robbed Jehovah God of what was rightfully his. We were made in such a way to give glory to Jehovah and him exclusively. So anything that takes away veneration, adoration, deep respect of a religious kind from Jehovah God, that's exclusively his province, and it's wrong. The sin is not so much the thing itself, but the misdirected worship that goes toward it. And when you think about that, it's possible to misdirect one's worship to all sorts of things other than an obvious idol. Now, we know that's true. Colossians chapter 3 is a good example. Perhaps you turn to that one. This is just to illustrate the point that idolatry can have forms other than literal images. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Deaden, therefore, your body members that are upon the earth, as respects fornication, uncleanness, sexual appetite, hurtful desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So all those things there, including covetousness, the worship of oneself, I suppose, they're all idolatry. We could maybe pick out another one out of the verse, the wrong kind of sexual appetite. One could become so obsessed with sexual greed that all respect for Jehovah's laws on the matter are overridden, they're suspended, and sex becomes elevated in one's life above Jehovah and is virtually idolized. And so you could think of a lot of other things that would slip into that category too. So taking the theme of our talk, idols to guard against, if we were looking for a general principle on the whole subject, we could say that they include anything that we permit to take the place of Jehovah in our lives, even if they take that place just a little bit. In fact, it's the things that just start to encroach upon Jehovah's worship that are the problems. We would very obviously see that having a statue in our front room that we worship was wrong, no question about that, but it's the fringe areas that we might not take quite so seriously, and it's some of those that we're going to discuss now. Lots of things are okay in themselves, but they become idolatrous when permitted to get out of proportion. To take an example, pictures of Christ Jesus. There is nothing wrong with them inherently, is there? But it's when they're venerated that it's wrong. And so with many other things. And when you think of it that way, lots of things in life strike you as potentially idolatrous. One's career, money, possessions, pleasure, all sorts of things. Now, just as a little mental exercise, I wonder what things you would list as idols that we should guard against as Christians, of the nature that we've been talking about. Now, maybe you would just like to think in your own mind for a moment things that you would pinpoint as rather difficult areas that we ought to be rather careful on. So perhaps you can be doing that. And I'll mention 4. That was 5. 4. These are 4 things that are not exhaustive, but they're 4 that the governing body would like to draw to our attention. I wonder how they sort of tally with the things that you're thinking about at the moment. Well, these are the 4 things. I think some are kind of obvious and others might surprise you. The first one is possessions. I guess we would have all picked that, wouldn't we? The next one likely you would have lighted on too. Individuals. But what about these other 2 points? Our bodies. And this is a strange one, you might think. Animals. Whenever have you heard of a brother or sister worshipping an animal? Well, we'll come on to that in a moment. Well, let's take them each in turn. Possessions. Let's try and work out when possessions become an idol. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16. Because everything in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes and the showy display of one's means of life does not originate with the Father, but originates with the world. You notice 2 of the phrases that we could extract there. It refers to the desire of the eyes, and then the other one we could examine, the showy display of one's means of life. So when things, possessions, become very desirable to us visually, when we have an overwhelming craving all the time for possessions that we see, be they in shop windows or in our imagination, when we've got to have the newest and the latest all the time and are never satisfied when we've got it and then it has to be replaced with something else, it's going too far. And then the showy display, well, it may be that we don't see our possessions as functional items to help us live, but as some symbol of our image in life, some status elevating symbol that we have this possession, be it clothing or whatever it should be, to try and impress others with just who we are or who we want them to think that we are. The showy display of one's means of life. Well, that's when it's going too far. It could apply to so many of our possessions. We've mentioned clothes. It could be perhaps our means of transport, perhaps a car or something like that. Maybe our homes or the things that are in our homes or other things too. When you think about possessions, they are to serve our needs. They perform a function. They're there to help us live in a practical way and also to enjoy life. But it's very easy for those possessions then to assume greater proportions and significance than that. And some people are so wound up about their possessions they won't even use them when they've got them. The front room is virtually a shrine or a holy of holies in some places, isn't it? You're not even allowed to sit on the settee once it's been bought. So when things get to that stage, those possessions are not serving our needs, we are serving their needs, and it's idolatry. So if you lay too much store on your material possessions, if they're a status symbol, or if they're the main thing in our life, or too valuable to be used, we're taking an extreme view that is idolatrous. So that's possessions. That would be one perhaps you would have guessed at. Now the second one that is mentioned is individuals, and maybe again you might have thought of the idolatry that is accorded to individuals. Years ago, evidently, it was national leaders that were idolized, kings, queens and politicians. But in recent years, such people have tended to be discredited in the popular mind, and other heroes have been put to the forefront. Sometimes it's those who excel in sports. On other occasions, of course, it's popular entertainers, particularly musicians. I saw a documentary a couple of years ago about Elvis Presley after he died, and it was the president of his fan club in America, and it was the annual meeting of the Elvis Presley fan club, and he said, "We have a special announcement to you. One of our members has had a vision, and in it Elvis has revealed that he's coming back again. There was going to be a second presence." Now maybe that is an extreme view, but it's not entirely untypical. When you think about it, businessmen and politicians exploit the inborn desire we have to worship, supposedly Jehovah, to gain influence and money. In some lands, sport is virtually a national religion, isn't it? Even maybe with some people in our land. Has that spirit affected us? Perhaps just a little bit. That's where the problem is, when it's just a little bit. For example, are you well able to list the names of your favourite team, whatever it should be? Or perhaps your favourite pop group? And do you refer to these folks by their first name, as if you were an intimate acquaintance of theirs, one of their friends? Well, many can do that, can't they? Could you list the names of the 12 apostles? Now, we might be hard-pressed to do that. If we've got all the walls in our bedroom or somewhere else in the house plastered with the pictures of such individuals, can you see any difference to what was going on in Jehovah's temple when Jaazaniah and the 70 elders had covered the walls of that inner room with their dungy idols? There really is no difference at all. Maybe what we were reading about in Ezekiel is not quite so distant from what affects us as we might have thought. Okay, so that's individuals. Third one, maybe this was a rather unusual one, was our bodies. You may have heard about the young man who was forever admiring himself in the mirror. And his friend approached him one day while this young man was looking in the mirror, and his friend said to him, "The trouble with you is that you're infatuated with yourself." And the young man, still longingly staring at himself in the mirror, said, "No, it's not infatuation with me, it's the real thing." Well, that's just a joke, I guess, but it does pinpoint a problem that has come up in recent years, perhaps in the past 5 years. There's been a tremendous fad for taking the natural concern that we have to keep healthy and attractive and fit to extremes, and the world has become crazed with all kinds of fitness clubs and taking interest in their health to extremes. Buying the latest workout book or way to health book written by some middle-aged film star. It really is something that the bookshops are full of. We can get so involved with this side of life, if we're not careful, that inordinate amounts of time and money and attention are lavished on them. Who of us have got many of those three things to waste anyway? And they are things that primarily should be devoted to the service of Jehovah, aren't they? And we could end up perhaps putting more effort into keeping fit, or in a rather sad way trying to regain our lost youth, rather than spending the time in serving Jehovah God. Just to quote a scripture that was cited yesterday in one of the items, it's that one in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, but this is from a different translation. This is from the Phillips translation. It says, "Bodily fitness has a limited value, but spiritual fitness is of unlimited value." Now, can you recall what it was that Jaazaniah and the 70 elders were worshipping on the walls of the inner room in Jehovah's temple? It was animals, wasn't it? And that's the fourth area that has been specified by the governing body for us to think about, our attitude to animals. The worship of animals can be a problem these days, perhaps in a different form though. Of course, Jehovah has made animals in such a way that they're very pleasurable. We can be fascinated by them as a subject for study, and they can give us much personal pleasure too. But unlike humans, animals were not made in God's image, were they? They are not able to glorify Jehovah God by reflecting his personality in human form, like humans have the potential for. So they should never be treated as substitute humans. But some do that, don't they? For example, they commit the error of turning to animals for love, which only humans can give. Some virtually view and treat their pets as babies or children. In fact, it might be difficult in some instances to differentiate between the treatment that some give to their animals and the treatment they give to children. Why today even pet cemeteries are not uncommon, are they? So though animals are to be treated with kindness, of course, many are giving them inordinate attention that borders on devotion, taking things to an extreme and turning their pets into idols. Now, it was very easy for us to be appalled at what was going on in the days of Jaazaniah in Jehovah's temple. But what about our attitude to what concerns us rather more, the modern day idols, these four things we've been talking about, and others that could be listed? Maybe we're very quick to condemn the ancient Israelites, or we might be quick to point out the wrongness of literal idolatry and false religion, or maybe point to other brothers and sisters and say that we think they take some things too far, but perhaps play down the things that affect us personally. Could we go back to Ezekiel chapter 8? Would you like to turn to that again? Just to bring back to our mind the very peculiar state of thinking that these people have got themselves into. It's just that last part of verse 12, just the last two sentences in verse 12. For they are saying, Jehovah's not seeing us. Jehovah's left the land. So whether that is to be taken literally or not, certainly they had completely desensitized their reaction to Jehovah God, and over a matter that was of the deepest concern to Jehovah. And there is the trap that we could fall into too. We may make excuses for our weak areas when it touches on idolatry and pretend that, well, aren't we taking this all a little bit too far? Isn't this a little bit exaggerated in its presentation, minimizing Jehovah's standards? In fact, some even say sometimes, well, I'm sure Jehovah wouldn't think or feel this or that way, as if they can make Jehovah God in their own image rather than the other way round. Anything that steals devotion, attention that rightfully belongs to Jehovah and is his exclusively, should touch a very deep chord of sensitivity within us. Just as Jehovah is jealous about these matters, as it says in the King James Version, it should be something to which we are very sensitive and shrink back from at the slightest hint of the possibility of idolatry. Human history is riddled with idolatry, isn't it? Just about everything has been worshipped. You know, the Tibetans call the mountain that people in the West refer to as Mount Everest, the largest mountain in the world. They call it Chomolungma, which when translated means Mother Goddess of the Earth. So from the very largest known thing on the earth that's been worshipped, you can think perhaps of the ancient Egyptians who worshipped insects, down to just about the smallest conceivable thing has been idolized, and everything you can imagine in between. And it's no surprise to us that the Bible is full of warnings about the dangers of idolatry in its various forms. 1 John chapter 5 verse 21, we read it, you recall it said, little children, guard yourselves from idols. That was one of the very last things that Jehovah had inspired, almost the last thing that was written in the scriptures. It must be of the utmost importance as far as Jehovah's concerned, and that it's in the Christian Greek scriptures indicates it should be of great importance to us as Christians too, doesn't it? So are we going to take as seriously as Jehovah does the need to guard ourselves from idols, whatever they are?